Who are you?
I'm a millennial. I've been feeling like a stereotypical millennial lately as like a non-binary, polyamorous, bisexual, gluten-intolerant, multi-hyphenate artist. There's this false binary of free will or determinism. I believe in free will, and I believe we don't have much of it, and they just have to coexist.
Do you believe in God?
I do believe in God, and I did not for a long time. I was like staunchly atheist for a while.
What is consent?
I describe consent as a practice of deep listening.
How do you orient towards purpose? What does that mean to you, and how do you define that?
Get in touch with your body, and here's how we can all have more connection in our lives and navigate conflict and identify what we want, ask for it, get it. Helping people with that feels like my purpose.
Who is Max Silver?
Max Silver is the character in the musical. So it's like me, but slightly different from me. I'm glad I'm a girl in the same way that I have no regrets. If I were born a man, I would know that I was lucky. But the fact is, I'm a woman and there's no sense complaining. No grudges, no regrets. What's the point? I desperately wanted to go through puberty. I thought like womanhood was on the other side. Femininity was on the other side. And if I could just become an adult or even like do the things, like shave my legs, shave my armpits, wear deodorant, get my period, then I would finally be like, oh, now I feel like a girl or a woman. And then it just like never came.
What's one question that you would leave the audience with to maybe shift their perspective or think about something in a different way?
What is blocking you from knowing yourself?
Welcome to today's episode of Getting to Know You. I'm your host, Cameron Edward Benton, and on today's episode, I have the great pleasure of introducing you to Mia Schachter. Mia is a writer, a consent educator, a teacher, a poet, a musician, a writer of musicals about tapeworms, and so much more. Mia is an absolutely fantastic and incredible, dynamic human being. This conversation is a pickup conversation from one that we did a month or two ago, where I unfortunately forgot to hit the record button, so we were willing to go back on this thing and do it again, and they were gracious to come on the show again to record a second time, and I think we just picked up where we left off, really jumping into a lot of their kind of newer work around multiple different topics, whether it's their relationship as a compatibilist, so dealing with free will versus determinism, their belief in God, and why consent is important. And one of the cool things we talked about in this conversation that we didn't get into the first conversation is their particular self-discovery around their gender identity as a non-binary person. For me as a cisgendered man, I found it really insightful to hear the actual experience of someone who doesn't identify with the gender they were necessarily given or raised with at birth, like I was. And as somebody who didn't grow up in a lot of queer spaces, didn't grow up around a lot of queer people, hearing their experience and what that was like was incredibly insightful, and I think you will enjoy that as well as finding out how powerful that was for them to realize and how that has bled into everything else in their life. Once again, Mia is a beautiful, wonderful person that you will enjoy getting to know. So without further ado, here is getting to know Mia Schachter. Who are you?
I'm Mia Schachter. I'm a writer and an artist, and I teach consent, and I'm an intimacy coordinator for TV, film, and theater. But I'd say primarily a writer. I'm a pet mom, pet parent to two cats and a dog. Who am I? I'm a millennial. I've been feeling like a stereotypical millennial lately as like a non-binary, polyamorous, bisexual, gluten-intolerant, multi-hyphenate artist. It's like textbook shit, but yeah, that's who I am.
Beautiful. I think that was something I was looking at our notes from the podcast that didn't get recorded.
Mm-hmm.
And something that I really appreciated about you, and it was a really big realization for myself at the end of it, was like how much you do and like how many different things,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's like writing or ceramics or teaching a class, or you do so many different things. And I realized that there was a part of myself in the previous conversation, and even asking other people, that was like, how do you give yourself the permission to do that? And I realized that was what drew me to, now I'm taking your Unblocked course, and it's like, that's what, like, the question that I'm wrestling with. So I kind of want to almost like jump into that. Like, how have you developed permission or consent within yourself to go do all of these different things and have so much fun with it?
Well, it's been a long process, I think. Like, my parents are boomers, and so there was definitely this mentality of like, it's fine to try anything as long as you're a kid, but like eventually you're gonna have to choose one thing, and that'll be your job until you retire. Um, and then I think at a certain point, I just began to feel like that wasn't really, I don't know, it's like reminding me of when I decided to get like visibly tattooed. It was like I was 27 and I was like, I'm clearly never gonna have a job where that's not okay.
Hmm.
So I'm just gonna do what I want. And I actually recently found a voice memo that I non-consensually recorded of a conversation that I had with my mom years ago. When I was living in Brooklyn, we would have these like FaceTime wine dates. We'd just like each get ourselves a glass of wine and FaceTime. And she was telling me that she had realized that I was never going to have this like one thing type of career, and that was like amazing and an asset. I don't know, I'll have to go back and listen to the recording. But it was, and then even like logically, rationally understanding that and agreeing with that, it has still taken years for me to really give myself permission um to like follow what I want to do, like where there's genuine desire, as opposed to saying like I should really just focus on the things that I'm already good at. And they're all just, I just see them as super related. So it doesn't even really feel like that many different things. Also, I just kind of can't do one thing. Like, I just sort of can't sit still. Like, it doesn't really feel like a choice that I made, It was like something that I was like, I guess this is it.
You're non-consensually given this archetype to live into.
Yeah, or a purpose, or yeah, like we don't choose those things.
Yeah. Well, that was something that I was listening to, I think, a podcast episode, and you were talking about, I feel like, being a compatibilist and kind of more towards determinism with like faith and some of these different things. Can you share what is your like perspective on that?
Yeah, okay. I studied philosophy in college, and that was like one of the main things that really stuck with me. It's a big topic in my book that's on Substack, and this sort of, again, like I mean, I say again because you're familiar, but everyone else is not, that I constantly like tearing down binaries, and there's this false binary of free will or determinism, or free will and fate. And I think at one point, in college at least, I really felt like I had to choose a side.
Hmm.
I started studying neuroscience, and there's this debate between neuroscientists and philosophers. A lot of philosophers want to believe in free will, and a lot of neuroscientists don't. That's not like 100% the case on in those two camps, but there is this kind of ongoing debate. And so I, at first, was really like, wow, yeah, I guess we don't really actually have free will. Everything is sort of predetermined, but we have the experience of free will, or the illusion of free will, which is really important for being a person in the world. But, if you stop believing in free will, then like the justice system crumbles. The whole idea that like anyone should be punished for anything crumbles. And I mean, I'm still pretty firmly there, like let's topple the justice system as it is right now. But I have gone towards the middle into like compatibilist territory, meaning that they're compatible ideas, they're not mutually exclusive. But I'm still like sort of towards the determinist side of things. However, I obviously talk a lot about free will and choice and autonomy and responsibility, accountability, taking responsibility for the choices you make. And I believe that that's really important. That's like how we stay in community and how we stay connected and how we grow and learn. And so yeah, I've been really circling around lately, like really circling around this idea of like hypocrisy and how it's sort of um I don't know if it's necessary, but it kind of just is, like I think there's a way that a lot of people want to be able to say that's hypocritical, and then like that undermines the whole argument and it's supposed to end everything there, when really like anyone getting accused of being hypocritical, like it's not effective. I mean, I think we're seeing that with like what's going on in Gaza right now. Like, there's people who are going to justify their hypocrisy in any way, shape, or form, and so an accusation of that doesn't really mean anything. But I've also been just thinking a lot about this idea of like, yeah, that like I don't I believe in free will, and I believe we don't have much of it. And like those are they just have to coexist.
Yeah. So they are somehow both happening at the same time. And I think for me, how I often see it is it's like there is some level of free will. I feel like there's some level of choice that I'm able to make, and there's so much beyond that. Like even if you took a sort of an understanding of like karma, right? There's like kind of three different words of what they use for karma. Like one of them is literally just like, hey, you were like born and you didn't choose your parents, you didn't choose all these different things, you didn't choose like all the historical events that led up to this moment in time where you are, and that has huge ramifications for your entire life, and you don't get to choose that or a lot of the things that happen after that. But like there is like a little bit of stuff that you can choose in between to go a different direction, to create a new path, and to jump into it. I even think of like I think it's Marcus Aurelius has this as a quote where it's you'll either be you can either run to fate or be dragged by it. And so there's like, a sense of like, well, maybe it's just about my attitude that I feel in the thing that I've been given.
Yeah, I think there's something about I was watching this thing that went viral with Andrew Garfield recently. It was just like a silly, dumb thing, like reality TV show that he was on for a second. And he asks his interviewer if she knows the difference between fate and destiny. And then she like blasts past it, and he never explains it. So but I was like I was like, what is it? And I Googled it, and they're related obviously, but like destiny is a sense of purpose, and then your where free will comes in is like accepting it or denying it. So like working towards it, or resisting it. And I do think that there's like steps along the way on any kind of journey in life that we have a certain amount of choice in. But I do think that we're largely a product of everything that came before, and the people who raised us, and the society we live in, and the opportunities we've been given. And, I mean, I even think about like, I'm a writer, but I'm a writer because my mom was a magazine editor. My dad has a journalism degree. His mom was a writer. Like I come from a lineage of writers. So that's what I do. I don't know that I would be doing it, and there's no way to know if I would be doing it if I had been, I don't know, like adopted or something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you kind of like mentioned a point that a lot of times I get to with a lot of these things. It's like, doesn't matter. Like, doesn't matter why or if. With free will and determinism, like a lot of the question I think I get to with these things is like, does it matter? Like, is it going to change how you actually like live your life or not when you're thinking about these, you're asking about these things? Because often I think that you can go really deep into these philosophical rabbit holes and all this stuff, but it's like, well, if it's not going to actually change how you live in some way, then is it practical? Is it useful?
Well, I think for some people it really would change how they live. I don't think it has super changed how I live. I have a really strong like Jewish community in LA, and I go to Torah study weekly, and one of the guys at Torah Study who I've become friendly with, we're like very unlikely friends. He's like, I think he's in his 60s. He like won't say his pronouns when we introduce ourselves. He's a really funny guy, and you know, we've like struck up this unlikely friendship. And I said something about like the parsha that we were reading one day, and I was like, I would just feel so guilty if I was saying, I feel like this is relevant, that because it was about like who gets punished and who can kill whom if someone kills like your brother, let's say. And I brought up how like I often think about, and like this is like pretty selfish, but I often think about how much it would fuck up my life to accidentally kill someone, or to like accidentally hit a cat, or you know, like I would be so heartbroken and devastated and feel so guilty that, you know, and thinking in the context of like our criminal justice system, to punish someone, you know, isn't it punishment enough? Like you have to like live with this horror that you did by accident. And you know, what is real justice there? Like, is it taking someone else's life as well? Anyway, I said this and about feeling guilty, and he was like, how could you feel guilty if you're a determinist? Which also was hilarious because it just meant that he had like remembered that about me, like from our Torah study session. So it was very, very sweet. But anyway, you know, the point being like, while I experience free will, it isn't, you know, whether or not I believe that we have much of it isn't affecting how I live my life. I still go around trying not to kill people by accident, and like, and thinking, you know, it wouldn't matter if it was like, I don't know. I mean, don't we all feel like regret or like, oh, I would do that differently? And it's like, well, if I were really living in such a way where like my lack of a belief in free will, or my belief that we don't have free will, if it were changing how I were living, then I would be able to say like, well, that's what was supposed to happen. And that's just like not what it's like to be a person, I think.
Yeah, no, I resonate with that a lot. I mean, that was why I started a blog that I think I did like 2 blog posts on when I first got out of college. And I wrote this like piece that was essentially I think it was like my closed mind on free will. And it was basically, my argument was like, nobody actually operates as if they don't have free will.
Yeah.
And like, that was kind of my experiential argument for it, was just like, well, nobody actually operates that way. Nobody actually goes through life as if they are just a cog in the wheel, or fully is like, oh, well, that was supposed to happen. No one is like that detached and emotionless. And like, I think that means something. You know, maybe not. Maybe we are just all in our own movie, but I feel like the human experience is, I don't know, my own basis for truth. So, yeah.
Well, I would also flip it and look at it like, even someone who doesn't believe in free will wants other people to act as though they have free will.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like if I don't believe in free will, and you keep like bumping into me, and I'm like, well, Cameron can't control that, or like that's happening because it's supposed to be happening.
Mm-hmm.
Like that would be absurd. I want you to take responsibility for yourself and what you do, your behavior, your words, you know. Even if I don't believe that we have much free will.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. This kind of pivots into a conversation that you and I were starting to have a lot of last time, around your Jewishness and around your personal theology and your relationship with all of that. And I realized that one question that we didn't really get to, but I think is present in there, is like, do you believe in God? And if so, like, what is God to you at this juncture in your life?
Oh, big questions. I do believe in God, and I did not for a long time. I think I was like staunchly atheist for a while, and then kind of agnostic about it. And then, but like often believed in some kind of like order to the universe, and like being a channel as an artist. and, you know, tapping into something somewhat transcendental creatively. And I think that what happened was that I kind of was like, oh, that's God. Like, that's what people are calling God. I just haven't been calling it that. You know, some kind of order, some kind of meaning, and like some kind of communication, like through my body. But part of it, more sort of concretely, was about illness. And when I was the sickest of my life, I was in like pretty intensive treatment for 9 months with like various prescriptions and herbs and diets and, you know, physical approaches. And I was doing all this research on like how people heal from the kinds of things that I was dealing with. It was like, it's like chronic illness, autoimmune, gut related stuff. I watched this documentary that sort of like polled people who experience radical remission. So those were people with like terminal diagnoses, not what I was dealing with, but they did this poll and they showed like there was like 75 factors that people reported the most of like what they did that they think caused their radical remission. And then they boiled it down to the top like 7 or 9. And it was change your diet, herbs, exercise, some kind of mindfulness, meditation practice. And then it was like believing in something larger than yourself and some sort of like spiritual ritual practice and community. So at that point, I was like so desperate to not be sick anymore that I kind of was like, I'll try it. Like, sure. And I also knew, I mean, and I write about this in my book too, like I knew that it wasn't something that I could fake. Like it wasn't going to work if I were faking it. So I couldn't like perform a belief in God. I had to really find a belief in God and like cultivate some kind of relationship there. But yeah, it turned out not to be very hard because there was like, I already had, you know, I had this sense of like something larger than myself and an order and my place within that order. And then like, yeah, that experience of kind of tapping into something that feels like you're a conduit more than a agent in whatever's coming out of you.
Yeah. You mentioned finding a place within that order. Where do you see your own place within that order?
Well, I think I've been thinking a lot lately about like how lucky I am to have such a strong sense of purpose. Um, I don't, I know that not everybody does. Um, and I think a lot of people do a lot of like amazing things, um, you know, without such a strong sense of purpose. But I mean, I do really feel that like the work I'm doing is important and that like I can do it in any medium. Um, but like the message is still the same. Um, so yeah, I mean, I really think I'm supposed to be talking about like the stuff that I'm talking about, you know, whether it's like, I mean, ultimately, I guess like trying to help people have like more connection in their lives, probably.
Yeah. And that's just for the audience sake, that's through the lens of consent and consent education.
Consent and communication and boundaries and, um, yeah, I think there's like a lot of stuff that kind of falls into, you know, or like branches out from there. But yeah, that's the kind of main point. Consent. Mm-hmm.
If you were giving a primer to somebody who, you know, maybe reads about consent education or those kinds of things online and whatnot, but like from your own vantage point, like what is consent?
I define consent as a practice, an ongoing practice of what I call full body listening. So listening in a very deep way with all your senses for more than just words. Um, and then using that information to, adapt, change course whenever necessary. I also describe it as a language, and so it's something that you can become fluent in. I describe it as something that can be felt in the body, so somatic, but also it's a practice that can be embodied in the sense that it can like move with you throughout everything you do. And then I also describe it as a path towards knowing yourself. So I think that's where like a lot of the overlap with creativity comes in. And I do, to tie it to like what we've been talking about so far, a really interesting thing has happened, or I've seen, and I went through it too, where I was like, I teach people consent all the time, obviously. And often what happens is people kind of hit a wall where it's like, what's beyond this wall is a spiritual practice and maybe even God or something that you would call something like that. And so, some people stop there and then other people keep going. And it's been really interesting because, like, I have a friend who does completely different work to me. He does like wilderness education, and he came to the same conclusion. Like, he was like, I was in this, very scientific master's program, and like, at a certain point, I had to kind of reject a lot of what I was learning because God, basically.
Yeah. Can you say more about that? I mean, you I guess where I want to dig into a little bit more specifically is you mentioned people kind of coming into this wall.
Yeah.
And kind of through that they come into contact with God or this other essence or whatever it is that you're talking to about. Like what
Yeah.
is the wall that people are running into, and then like how are
Uh-huh.
they through that, and then what is it they're tapping into?
Yeah, great question. So I described consent as a practice of deep listening.
Hmm.
And I think that the wall is the body, essentially. So what happens is that people kind of reach a point where they're like, okay, I have all the information and I have the tools and the language and the practices. But if they won't go into their body and like listen in that deeper way, there is, there's just kind of a limit. I think the information is still really valuable and it still changes people's lives and it's really important. But, I think, like, I don't know many musicians or trans people who don't believe in something like God. Like, I just read Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act.
Hmm.
Like, he clearly believes in something like God.
Hmm.
And it's like about being a channel, a conduit, listening really deeply to what your body is telling you. And then as an artist, having some kind of creative output. But when it comes to consent, it's this way of just being like exceptionally present, exceptionally honest and authentic, and really listening to the other person, listening to the moment and the surroundings and how your body is reacting to what is happening. For a long time, when I was an atheist, I was studying acting, and acting is the same shit. It's being present, it's listening, it's mindfulness, it's reacting honestly, being a conduit, and I remember talking about that as like the closest thing I'd ever had to a spiritual practice, that feeling of like transcendence and like being so purely in the moment. So now for me, that's something that I really get from like a consent practice, or having that as part of my life. interestingly, like more so than being a religious Jew.
Hmm.
Like I'm really getting it from elsewhere. I get more community from the Jewish stuff. But anyway, that's all to say, like the I'm trying to think of your original question. Um,
Talked about like the wall, finding the wall, how to get through the wall, and then
yeah.
what is it that you tap into, which I feel like you
Oh
did
yeah,
pretty
yeah.
well.
Yeah, I think I covered everything. I think the point about acting is like it's interesting that there was like I was that was clearly like something that I wanted, but I like
Hmm.
wasn't calling it
Hmm.
God or religion or
Yeah.
whatever. Um and then also to sort of find whatever that thing is for myself through a creative practice is like,
Yeah.
brought it back kind of full circle.
Yeah, I've had very, very similar experiences. I was in LA pursuing an acting career for a period of time and like,
Hmm.
went to classes and did all the different stuff. And I found through a specific um, I don't know, acting teaching called Viewpoints that was like deeply, deeply, I would have these, kind of spiritual experiences of like attunement with
Yes.
others, right? Where it's like your bodies are in sync and relationship to each other. That is something beyond words, and like everyone can feel it. And like you're, you'd be marching around in a circle for I forget how many times. You just keep marching and marching until you did like 8 jumps at the exact same time, and nobody's allowed to say anything. Nobody's allowed to
Hmm.
do anything, right? But
Hmm.
like eventually you would do it, and like you found this way of like tapping into when was the right time to jump without anybody giving a cue, without anybody doing anything. And I that feeling that I got from that was something that I always and still kind of like crave, where it's like I want that
Hmm.
like deeper experience of listening and tuning into the body. Um, that said, I think that's something that's really great when you're in an acting class or when you're doing these different things. But like, how does somebody who's just, they're going to the office every day and they're coming back, like, how do they actually like develop these skills and this kind of abstract idea of like listening to your body? Like, what does that actually mean, and how does somebody actually do it?
Well, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. There's like somatic therapists, there's somatic experiencing practitioners, there's dance, yoga. I think there's loads of ways to do that. You can also just sit still and like do a body scan and see if your body has any information to give you. I think a lot of it is though, it's like a lot of trust because you kind of have to trust that you're not making this up,
Hmm.
I guess, which is ultimately, I mean, and here's like perhaps the religious aspect, like that's faith, that's really just faith, like that I'm not concocting whatever my body is telling me, but that it's actually coming from something real. Um, I mean, even like believing that I have a purpose, right? Like, I'm sure there's people who would be like, that's cute, you know? Um, but like, you just really want to do this thing. And so it feels like your purpose.
Hmm.
And like, sure, that's fine. I mean, it, reminds me of like what you said earlier. It's like, well, that believing that it's my purpose is tangibly changing how I live my life.
Right.
And so I'm choosing to believe that.
Hmm.
Um, that belief brings a lot more meaning into my life than the alternative.
Yeah.
Um, Getting into your body, I mean, you said someone who's like working in the office or whatever, and it's really hard for me to say because, as I said, I'm like a person who wears many hats. I work for myself. I've never had a real office job. I did one time for like 9 months. And I think it's extremely challenging for someone who, well, and then I think it also requires like a certain rejection of a lot of norms and systems that we live in. And so for someone who is going to an office every day, which makes me think certain things about, I don't know, like they're stuck in a hamster wheel and
Hmm.
it's really hard to get out. And I think for a lot of people, because it's so hard to get out, um, they won't let themselves recognize the way that they're a puppet, essentially,
Hmm.
and I don't mean to say that in such a way where I'm like, those people are like that. Like, you
Yeah.
know, I've been like that, dealt with that, moved through a lot of that, but it also comes up again and again. Like, it's like always something to be fighting against. But, you know, it's like one of those things where when you start pulling on the thread, like the whole sweater unravels.
Hmm.
So it's a little hard to, because our society, like the world that we live in, like divorces us from our bodies. Even our medical system is based on like a dualist, a
Hmm.
Cartesian dualism, that there's a mind and there's a body and they're two separate things.
Right.
Um, so, you know, if you won't look at that, like for me, I was like sick. And so I started to look at like, well, why am I sick and what's keeping me sick? And then it became this like, you know, it's really like a feminist issue. I'm basically getting diagnosed with modern day hysteria again and again in the form of anorexia. I'm like being, you know, people are profiting off of giving me band-aid prescriptions rather than trying to find out the root cause. The root cause could be like, you know, our agricultural system and pesticides and GMOs. It could also be genetic. It could also be whatever, this, that, and the other thing, factory farms and like blah, 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 blah. Anyway, the point being like illness and disability really radicalized me, and the thread started to get pulled. And then like you start looking at gender and sexuality and monogamy and like all these things. And then it all just kind of starts to crumble. And it's hard to then set your alarm and go to the office in the morning.
Very well said. Yeah, I think that, like, to your point with that person being on the hamster wheel, it's like in the typical world that we are told that we should be living in, or like the way that we should be living our lives, it's like we don't have a second to breathe and check in and like feel what our body actually feels. Or if we do, we're told to like ignore those things. I think
Yes.
that's something that I see with so many people that I will talk with. And I have been in a similar adventure, maybe not quite as wild as yours, where it's like I'm, not doing a bunch of different artist things, but like I've always worked in a job that was meaningful to me in some way, shape, or form, and was part of something bigger. Or the companies that I worked for, I was able to be really entrepreneurial. And now I do my own, business consulting stuff and like do the podcast and do these different things. And I talk to friends who have a normal job, I want to say, and they're like, yeah, but like, regardless of the fact that like they're so miserable or unhappy or whatever it is, it's like, but it's like, okay, well, but like I keep making like the money, and it's like this weird existential thing where it's like, but like how much money do you actually like need? Like, and like when is that point like enough for you? And like, have you ever considered that you might be able to find a place that actually does align with your values and who you want to be, and like your heart of hearts, and like the fact that like the vast majority of your time and your experience in that time is like the actual like, most precious thing that you have.
Yeah.
So if you actually just like felt good most of the day on a regular basis, you'd probably up level your life in a whole bunch of other ways.
Yeah, I've been doing a little bit of a dive into like very old journals.
Mm.
And one of the things that I read today from when I was like 21 was like, am I am I helping people by doing by like living my purpose? And like what if my purpose, this was like when I was studying acting, so it was like I was like, what if my purpose is acting? Like, is that kind of
Mm.
selfish? Who am I really helping if I'm doing this? And then I sort of got to a point where I was like, maybe it's ultimately really helping the world, like best for the world, for us each to be doing what our purpose is.
Mm. Yeah. How do you define like what purpose is? Because I think a lot of times we associate, especially within our capitalist world, like purpose with career in some way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
How do you orient towards purpose? What does that mean to you, and how have you defined that?
Well, I mean, again, I feel really fortunate that like for me it's really clear. So it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't feel um it feels more like a message than a job.
Hmm.
Um, you know, the message being like get in touch with your body, and like here's how we can all have more connection in our lives, and like navigate conflict and ask for what we want, identify what we want, ask for it, get it. Like helping people with that feels like my purpose. In the world as it is today, that means that I have to get paid to help people do those things.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it would look like if I didn't have to get paid. But yeah, I think there's like, I have to imagine that there's like other types of purposes in the world that like don't really make sense as careers. So yeah, that's like kind of a trap.
Yeah. Well,
For sure.
I think you said it beautifully and like in a perspective that I had not really heard before, right? That like your purpose really is, it's not the, like being a consent educator is not your purpose. It's the message behind that that comes through the work that is your purpose, right? When that like purpose shows up in your friendships and how you treat your family and how you show up with your art and the fact that you do those different pieces, right? Like you could do ceramics like you do and just be like, I'm not gonna like post it, but like that's also not in line with that purpose, because even if the ceramics aren't exactly about consent, right? It's like this entire practice is somehow evoking these questions and having people lean in and be curious and like want to hear your message and your voice through these things.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, cool. How did you get into ceramics, by the way? That's like a oddball question, but
Well, I was living at 110th Street between Broadway and Amsterdam, and I went walking one summer after classes had ended and passed a pottery studio like a block or two away from my apartment. And I walked inside and I was like, I would love to take a class. Like, I mean, I've said, like, I can't really sit still. So, like, it was the summer and I was staying in New York and I was like, I know classes are over, but, like, I'm going to do something that I like and learn something new. And they had a class starting, like, within a few days. So I just signed up and got really obsessed. And that was, like, 15 years ago.
wow.
Yeah.
Oh wow, so you've been doing it for a while. I don't know why I was like under the impression that you'd been doing it for like the last like 2 or 3 years or something like that.
Oh, no. I'm very good at it. I've been doing it a very, very, very long time.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. You also have released an album or two albums amongst all of the things you do, and you're writing a musical about your friend the tapeworm.
Yes.
I was wondering, like, if you could talk to us about, like, who is Max Silver, like this other part of yourself, I guess.
Cool. Yeah, I've released 2 EPs under the name Max Silver, and I just finished a full record that's the soundtrack to my musical about a tapeworm that I had. The character Max Silver is the character in the musical. So it's like me, but like slightly different from me. The name, I felt a need for the name for a couple super practical reasons. One is that I was starting to intimacy coordinate porn and I wanted a pseudonym. And the other reason was that as an intimacy coordinator for TV and film, it seemed pretty important. I think there's still a way that a lot of people, especially TV producers, if it looks like you do too many things, they think you're like somewhat scattered and you're probably not very good at this intimacy coordination in my case. Or you're not very dedicated, you're spread very thin, and like why would, if you're doing 75 things, like this isn't your primary focus, that carries a certain amount of weight. So I wanted to make sure that my art life didn't come up when you Google Mia Schachter. So that was like the main impetus for the name departure. But it's also like, I don't know, it kind of speaks to like gender stuff, to like have this other, name that I can use when I want to. who is that person? I mean, that person is an artist first and foremost. I think there's a way that I'm like trying to become more and more aligned with that person actually. In the musical though, they're a kind of sullen musician, like purely a musician. I'd say they're a bit more like mask leaning than I myself am, or how I feel in this moment anyway. So they're like, they're me, but they're slightly different.
Are you open to like sharing about your, I guess, your journey and experience with your gender identity and like how you've come to your, I don't know, whatever your current understanding is as a non-binary
Yeah.
person?
Yeah, it's funny, I also read in my journal today this thing that really shocked me
Hmm.
about this. So I'm gonna just read it to you. I took a photo of it because I was like, oh my God, that's wild. So this is what I wrote. This was 2011. I'm glad I'm a girl in the same way that I have no regrets. If I were born a man, I would know that I was lucky. But the fact is, I'm a woman and there's no sense complaining. No grudges, no regrets. What's the point? I can't say I wish I were a boy. It's a waste. Obviously, in that moment, not really understanding that like being trans was a possibility. Um, so I guess in high school, I used to like describe myself and um, my sexuality as like a gay boy.
Hmm.
Um, and I grew up really, really thinking that it was like just obviously better to be a boy, that like everyone knew that. Um, which obviously everyone does not know that. Like primarily trans women. So I thought that that was a given.
Hmm.
Uh, but yeah, I kind of was like, but I'm a girl, so like I'm just gonna make the best of this. Um, I guess later, like I wrote a play about a breakup, um, where like the breakup happens in real time, and the actors, like five actors, played these two characters. They like
Hmm.
swap in and out. So like the gender was changing, the race was changing, like the
Hmm.
identities were changing. Um, so I look back on things like that and I'm like, okay, this was something that I was always kind of like exploring and playing with and interested in. Um, but I guess, yeah, like I was always pretty open about like my experience of my gender, and it just sort of, I just started describing it differently as I learned new language. I remember reading Eileen Miles' book, Chelsea Girls, and saying, like, giving it to my mom and saying, like, the way that Eileen talks about their gender is like the closest that I've ever heard anyone talk about gender to how I feel about my gender. They talk about like, um, getting like quote unquote mistaken as a for a boy, and like how affirming that is,
Hmm.
and getting called sir and stuff. And
Hmm.
um yeah, I mean, and then I guess like it was like for a while I thought I couldn't really call myself non-binary because I like benefited so much from like being perceived as a cis woman. um and then a bunch of people in my life who are trans and non-binary were like, that's stupid. Like, you could use that word if it feels right to you. And then I started using she and they pronouns at one point, and then
Hmm.
there was this like really clear switch where all of a sudden like people would say she about me, and I would like be like, who are we talking about?
Hmm.
um and that was when I waited a little while to see if that was consistent before being like, all right, no, like these are my pronouns, this is how I identify. And like, letting it really, I mean, I feel like I've always kind of dressed really androgynous. But I really did let myself lean into like, or push against what I had always sort of thought was the only option for me that came from my mom, sort of like my mom's version of like raising her kids in a feminist way was like, you just want to be like the most attractive version of yourself so that you have the most men to choose from. Like that was empowerment, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so she would like, she got me like laser hair removal on my upper lip when I was in high school. And like, you know, and she thought she was helping. Like she really thought she was doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, yeah, I really kind of let myself just let go of a lot of those things that I thought were like required for me.
When you were talking about you would hear the word she, and all of a sudden you'd be like, who are you talking about, or who are they talking about? Is that what people refer to as like gender dysphoria?
I would think for some people, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder, yeah, I guess that's probably a kind of, or like one experience of gender dysphoria.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. And I guess for you, that kind of experience, did you, and it was gender something you wrestled a lot with or thought about a lot with throughout the course of your life? Or like, how did you, I guess even start to have those questions? Because I think for myself, like, as a cis white dude, it's not something that I had a lot of like, you know, that hasn't been a big question in my life through a lot of pieces. It has now as I've entered more career spaces and entered other people and started to question, be curious about these different things. But I'm curious for yourself. I think we're about the same age as well. Like, how did this stuff get introduced to you, and how did you start asking? Why did you start asking?
Well, you know, as I said, like I just thought that it was obviously better to be a boy. And I think
Hmm.
eventually like realizing that other people weren't having that experience
Hmm.
was eye-opening. Um, I think there's like, I don't know, as a kid it wasn't like you know, it's not so obvious how different like binary like boys and girls are because you
Hmm.
haven't gone through puberty. And then I think the way that now I can understand part of what was going on, but like I was a late bloomer and I desperately wanted to go through puberty. There were like
Hmm.
all these things. I thought like womanhood was on the other side, femininity was on the other side. And if I could just become an adult or even like do the things, right? Like shave my legs, shave my armpits, like wear deodorant, get my period, then I would finally be like, oh, now I feel like a girl or a
Hmm.
woman. Um, and then it just like never came. Like all those
Hmm.
things happened and I felt the same
Hmm.
and they didn't bother me. Like I still like wearing makeup sometimes and um I don't get dysphoria from my period. I used to be like pretty obsessed with periods. Um like I had a blog about periods.
A blog
Um
post or a whole blog about them?
no, I had a whole Tumblr called Bloody Shorts that was short stories of people's first period.
Oh my god, that's amazing.
I'm sure it's still there. There's still stickers around Bushwick, which is wild because it's like I haven't added to it in like 10 years. But anyway, um, yeah, was I wrestling with it? I mean, I think there is like a privileged place that in gender experimentation that like AFAB people, you know, people assigned female at birth, people who are raised as girls, um, get because masculinity is prioritized, is you know seen as better. So when we act like tomboys, you know, that's not looked down upon. Whereas
Yeah.
like for people who are seen as boys to be more feminine or to wear dresses or to like dolls or whatever, like they get the shit kicked out of them
Hmm.
figuratively and literally. So there's a certain way that like, you know, and the sort of shadow side of that is that like when I express my gender differently, it doesn't get read any differently by people. So there's this like invisibilizing aspect to it. You know, I can wear um like a suit and tie and people are like, "Oh, that's a woman in menswear." You know, so it just like doesn't always register with other people, even though it feels different to me. Anyway, did I always wrestle with it? I mean, I think it's an interesting, it's a little bit of like a chicken and egg thing around language where it's like I was having these feelings obviously and like have this sort of predisposition and I don't really express femininity and womanhood in most of the stereotypical ways, but um it was only something that I began to really consciously explore because the language came into the vernacular, you know,
Yeah.
pronouns, gender binary, like non-binary, trans, you know, all these terms. And then it starts to go like, oh, how do these feel to me?
Once you found the words that fit you and the expression that fit you and how you wanted, like how you felt on the outside or express yourself on the outside, it resonated with how you felt on the inside. How did that start to change your life, if at all?
Um, well, it changed my life a lot in positive ways and negative ways. I think, you know, I was talking earlier about like connection, and I obviously like really value relationships. And I definitely went through a period of being like very rigid about, you know, who could be in my life and the language they had to use. Um, and that, you know, that was really hard. I think I had higher hopes than what a lot of people were living up to in my life. You know, I think it's reasonable to expect like your immediate family to like do the work and like people who close to you who want to stay close to you, but it's less reasonable to expect like the, you know, the office assistant at your doctor's office to like, and also like what a waste of time and energy. Um, but I think I started to feel more well, I certainly think I felt a like more grounded sense of self. I think having a clear sense of like this is who I am and this is how I understand myself because I understand myself. Um because I know myself. Like that certainly changes a life, I think.
Yeah. Well, it makes me like feel like it's like circling back around to the conversation we were having about tuning into your body and your felt sense, and
Mm-hmm.
like the somatic idea, and like getting to this message around consent through these things and this like deeper listening, right? Like part of it sounds like for you was even at a young age you were sort of had some level of awareness on these things, right? And like, okay, there's this like change, and like even as you reflect back on it, it's like I go through all these womanhood things, and none of this kind of feels right. I don't feel this thing, and there's a trust, a deep trust of that feeling, I think too,
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of people, kind of like we were talking about, have been taught to ignore whatever that is, to disregard it, to throw it away, or just go into just a pure kind of like fact-based approach, or this like objective stance that there isn't something deeper, and that touches on to a conversation I think you were having about like these I think it's like the 5 patterns of people who start consent education, and
Mm-hmm.
you were talking I think about uh, shoot, I honestly don't remember what my last train of thought, but I think there was something around um, just like the pendulum swings, I guess, that we go on
Oh, uh-huh.
um, with those kinds of things. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I know. Are you able to to speak to some of that?
Yeah.
Sorry, I lost my train of thought with that, but
Yeah, I think I probably know where you were going too. I think often when a lot of people like, crack open this can of worms, so to speak, they, oh wow, the sunset is incredible today. I just have like a couple inches of window where I can see it, but it looks beautiful. Yeah, like when you crack open this can of worms, as I said, like you pull the thread and you think you're just pulling it about this one thing, and then the whole thing unravels. Like when you start to learn about consent, it's really hard to just learn about consent, because all of a sudden you have to look at all the ways that you've been, socially coerced, and how you've been like brainwashed essentially by movies, TV, music, pop culture, magazines, to like, this is how you're supposed to be, this is what you're supposed to want, this is how you're supposed to act, this is the kind of sex you should be having. And it's no wonder to me that a lot of people go like, I just realized that I'm non-binary, and then they're like, and I'm also polyamorous, and I also am neurodivergent, and I'm also like, I'm queer, and I like all these things, sort of the whole Jenga tower topples. And there's not really a way around that, I think. Which also becomes a really interesting question in like teaching consent, like across cultures, because there's like a lot of cultures where I think the way that I'm talking about these things like simply doesn't apply. Like, I have a student right now who is from Egypt, and like, she talks about how women like legally don't have like the rights to their own bodies essentially. And so like the way that I'm like, and then you start questioning the gender binary. It's like, that does not apply, like that's not where we're going with this. So it's an interesting thing to just sort of see, like, because my work is global, that like it's just people are having to really make it their own in ways that I would never expect. Yeah. Anyway, you brought up the pendulum. Yeah, a lot of people learn about consent and they think it's all about saying no. And I think for a lot of people, for a while at least, it really is, because you realize you've never really said no in your life, and you've done so many things that you didn't want to do. And so they get what I call no happy. They just start saying no to everything. And, I think especially for people who've like reached burnout, that can be a really important phase for a while. But eventually you start to get a lot of FOMO, you miss your friends, people stop calling you, you feel really isolated, really lonely. So the pendulum then tends to kind of like, it has to kind of go back to the middle a little bit. But I wonder if you were also getting to the one about like this sort of realization that like everything is non-consensual, and how I'm like very wary of people going down that road.
It wasn't that, but I do like that part of the conversation. I did realize what it was, and it might not have actually been the same article because I was like digesting a bunch of your stuff yesterday, so it's probably just getting conflated. But it was the importance and like the distinction between like basically the consent as like a fact-based practice versus a feeling practice, and also just how important and how much more interesting and valuable feelings are. And you said something almost to the extent where it's like, I'm interested more in feelings over
than facts. Yeah,
which is like kind of the opposite rhetoric that I don't really hear it as often as we used to. But there was like a strong component that originally I think started in the left that was like facts over feelings, and then the right side eventually took it and was like, oh, it's like facts over feelings, you soft snowflake kind of things. And that now it's become where like I actually really agree with you more and more. Like the more over the last, I would say, 8 years of my life, I've really worked to tune more and more and more into my own feeling state, and like being aware of, and like that is what guides a lot of my thought process. And even like I remember being in ethics class in college and like learning that like if you're like feeling centers are disabled, you literally can't make a decision. I remember like one story where this guy had his brain literally fucked up in that way, and he couldn't choose between like a red and blue pen because he had to like figure out which one was the right one to do. and was just stuck. And it's like, if people just realize how much of your decision making, regardless, is emotional,
Gut.
you're gonna make faster decisions, which is usually a better
faster decisions.
Yeah, and you're gonna be able to like learn more and tap into those and trust your feelings to then create thought and communication versus trying to think your way through everything.
100%. I mean, I think, the point that I made that you're referencing is like, when I say I'm more interested in feelings than facts, it's because people are always going to argue about facts.
Mm-hmm.
We don't share enough of, reality is subjective. Like, I'm going to say, you said this, and you're going to be like, no, I said it like this. And I'll be like, okay, well, it made me feel this. And the more important thing is like for us to tend to how we're both feeling than like what was actually said. And I may be reacting to something that you think you didn't say, but what does it matter? Like, we're having these feelings now, and that's what we have to address, especially in terms of trying to maintain connection. In terms of like, what's the question? Like, consent, how does that relate to consent?
I think it was more just like wanting to explore that like idea and like kind of looping back around to this idea of like I would say facts over feelings. What is it that feelings can teach us that like facts can't, and why is that distinction important?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm also like, I've been thinking about how to say this in a way that I like lately, which is that like my feelings are not always valid. Like, people often say, like, your feelings are valid. And I'm like, they're not always valid. Like, sometimes my feelings are insane. Sometimes my feelings, like, make no sense. Sometimes my feelings are happening because I'm triggered, which means that they have everything to do with something that happened a long time ago and nothing to do with what's happening right now. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that they're not real and something that we need to address. It also doesn't mean that they're like illegitimate. They're happening for a reason. They're coming from a place. I'm not saying that they're wrong. Right. But it might not, it's not always, I think, like the most helpful thing to be like, your feelings are valid. Because sometimes I'm like, I'm freaking out. I'm having a meltdown right now. I don't think these feelings are really valid. I think we need to like regulate my nervous system. The feelings are bonkers.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think where I would push back slightly on the language is that, like, I still think even if they're completely crazy and irrational, they're still valid, right? It is what's happening. And I think, like, a lot of the struggle with our nervous system sometimes gets into a place where we don't want to feel these things. Like, this shouldn't make any sense. I don't want to feel this way. And we start to resist that, right? And it's like, it's often like just being even to able to acknowledge the fact that you're angry at yourself for being angry, and like if you can just like accept that part, then it starts to kind of unwind the whole thing, right? But I also agree with you that I think sometimes that same phrase can be used as like an excuse for bad behavior or an excuse to dominate somebody else because somebody's having an emotional experience,
right?
And disregarding somebody else who's involved in the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I truly think I've like definitely had the experience where I'm like, yeah, I'm having these feelings and I don't think they're even like your problem. Like I'm taking them out on you. They're not your problem. And then had a partner say like your feelings are valid, and I'm like, I don't know that they are. Like, I don't think so.
That's totally fair. What's one of the biggest myths about consent?
Oh, that it's like a rule book, and that it's very clinical and sterile and boring, robotic.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite statements you've said is like math, or it's not a math problem to be solved.
Oh, yeah. You brought that up. Like, I think what I said there was like, it's not a formula to follow. It's not math with like a right or wrong answer. It's a lot more like an English class or an art class where it's like you're learning to interpret.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I think we're basically at time now, although I always wish I could talk to you for forever. The last question I ask all of my guests is, what's one question that you would leave the audience with to maybe shift their perspective or think about something in a different way?
Gosh, it's funny. I don't remember what mine was last time.
I think you asked
But
them to ask you a question. Or like to tell you what you thought about the
oh,
episode, essentially, but then we didn't hit record, so.
oh yeah. I mean, what's coming to mind now is like, what is like blocking you from knowing yourself? That would be the question.
Cool. Awesome. Well, Mia, thank you again for coming on the show. It was great to have you
You're
on, and
welcome.
talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks again. I'll see you Wednesday.
Yeah. See you in class.
Okay, bye.